Welcome to Hourglass Secrets. In the quiet corners of late Victorian England, some stories never reached the front pages. They lived instead in whispers, in troubled family memories, in the shadows of places that preferred not to remember. And this one is among the most unsettling. It begins with a young woman shaped by loneliness, drawn to the warmth of a household that was never hers, and pulled into a secret life that would cost her everything. Imagine yourself standing on a narrow village lane, the kind where the evening air carries the smell of wood smoke and the sound of distant church bells. A gentle world on the surface, yet beneath it, a story of deception, longing and betrayal was quietly unraveling. A woman who had spent most of her life searching for somewhere to belong would soon step into a choice that would lead her toward the darkest fate imaginable. And as you listen, remember, every detail you're about to hear is true. No fiction, no embellishment, just the chilling path that history left behind. Annie Pritchard's early years were marked by heartbreak long before her name ever entered the records of crime. As the eldest in a struggling family, she knew loss from childhood. Parents gone, siblings scattered, a lifetime spent stitching together whatever sense of home she could manage. So when she met a warm, lively household where she felt noticed, valued, almost needed, she gravitated toward it. That household belonged to the Macabres. At first, it was nothing more than friendship, a young woman in need of affection, and a married man who should never have stepped beyond the boundaries of respectability. But step he did. Quietly at first, then with a confidence that only secrecy can breed. Their closeness grew while his wife remained unaware, and Annie, who had long felt invisible, mistook hidden affection for a promise. In time, whispers of a mysterious fiancé named Guy Anderson began circulating around her, a man no one had ever met, yet one she spoke of with certainty. She claimed marriage was near. She said her future was finally taking shape. But behind the story was a different truth, the life forming inside her, a child she could not explain without revealing everything. By the spring of 1892, the walls of her world tightened. She left home under the guise of traveling to Liverpool to marry this unseen man. Letters followed, posted from Liverpool to keep the illusion alive. Yet Annie was nowhere near the docks or the northern streets. Instead, she had slipped away to Northampton, adopting a new identity and presenting herself as Mrs. Anderson. The man beside her was not Guy at all, but Andrew Macabre. Her pregnancy advanced quietly in that rented space. No family, no familiar faces. Just Annie, a secret she could not undo, and a man whose intentions remain a source of unease even today. On the 23rd of June, 1892, she gave birth to a son, a child who should have marked a beginning, but instead marked the beginning of the end. What followed in the coming weeks would become one of the most disturbing disappearances of the Victorian era. Before we begin, please hit subscribe and tell me, what state are you listening from? The small rented rooms in Northampton should have offered calm after the turmoil of Annie's departure from home, yet the atmosphere inside them was anything but peaceful. The couple presented themselves politely to their landlady as Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, a quiet pair keeping to themselves. But beneath the civility, the foundations of their arrangement were unstable, stitched together with secrecy, shame, and the pressure of a newborn life, depending entirely on two people who were already living a lie. Annie had always carried herself with gentleness, but new motherhood deepened the vulnerability around her. The birth had exhausted her, and the weeks that followed demanded strength she barely had. The child was small, fragile, restless, a constant reminder of the choices that had led her far from home. In her letters to her sister, she still spoke of Liverpool, still insisted she was preparing for marriage to a man no one had ever seen. These weren't malicious lies, more the clinging of someone trying desperately to protect her family from scandal she feared they would never forgive. Meanwhile, Andrew navigated the situation with a strange blend of confidence and distance. He made arrangements, came and went, and occasionally hinted that travel or change might be necessary soon. To the landlady they were courteous enough, but the couple's odd absences and their careful avoidance of visitors stirred small concerns. Victorian boarding houses thrived on observation, and the Andersons, who were not Andersons at all, were proving hard to read. Still, for several weeks, life carried on in a quiet, uneasy rhythm. Annie tended to her son with a tenderness shaped by years of caregiving within her own broken family. Her voice softened when she spoke to him. She tried to believe this new start could settle. Perhaps she hoped that once the chaos settled, she and the child would find a place in the world where judgment would not destroy them. But outside those walls, Andrew's responsibilities, his wife, his children, and the fragile arrangement he had created were tightening around him. His frequent outings grew longer. His temper flickered more easily. Something in him seemed to shift as the newborn's cries echoed through the cramped rooms. By mid-July, talk of leaving Northampton began to surface, not for a fresh start, but as a sudden ambiguous plan, decided largely by Andrew himself. On the morning of the 20th of July, the couple packed belongings into boxes, preparing for a departure no one fully understood. Annie carried her child in her arms when they walked out of the lodgings. It was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. When Annie stepped out of the Northampton lodgings on the 20th of July 1892, holding her infant close, there was nothing outwardly alarming about the scene. She and Andrew left quietly, offering polite thanks to their landlady and giving the impression of a couple simply moving on. Yet within hours, the uneasy calm surrounding their departure shifted into something far darker. Andrew returned alone later that same day. The child was not with him. Annie was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he carried boxes, heavy ones, into the room they had just vacated. His clothes were marked with dust. His manner seemed hurried, detached, almost distracted. The landlady noticed, though she said nothing. Boarding house owners witnessed many peculiar behaviours, and Victorian discretion often disguised concern. But what Andrew did next raised questions no one could ignore. He purchased a quantity of lime, enough to suggest a purpose beyond household use. In that era, lime was commonly associated with one thing: speeding the decay of organic matter. He also hired a horse and cart, claiming he needed to move luggage. The explanation was plausible enough, yet combined with his solitary return and Annie's unexplained absence, it painted a troubling picture. Days passed. No letters arrived for Annie's family, no word from Liverpool. Her sister, who had always sensed something uneasy about her movements, grew increasingly anxious. By early August, silence became unbearable. She sent a letter, urging Annie to reply and begging for reassurance that she was safe. But the message reached an empty room. The Andersons, real and false, were long gone. Meanwhile, residents on the outskirts of Northampton noticed an odd, sour smell drifting from a hollow beside a quiet country lane near Dallington Heath. At first, no one investigated. Unpleasant smells were common in rural areas, especially during warm weather, but as days passed, the stench intensified until it became impossible to ignore. Local workers, finally compelled to look closer, discovered something that would shift the entire case from mystery to horror. A sack lay half buried in the earth, its coarse fabric stained, its shape unmistakably wrong. Marked with the letters EMRA Northampton, it had once belonged to a nearby warehouse. When the authorities arrived and opened it, the truth emerged in its most brutal form: a female body, headless, armless, decomposed beyond recognition. Clothing remained, 2 skirts, a blouse, but nothing that could directly name the victim. No infant was found, no trace of a second body, no sign of the child she had carried out of the lodgings that July morning. For several days, the corpse lay unidentified, a woman swallowed by cruelty and lime. And while the investigators searched for answers, one question echoed with unsettling force: Where was Annie Pritchard? The discovery at Dallington Heath shook Northampton with a quiet, suffocating dread. Victorian England had seen its share of hardship, but a mutilated body lying in a country hollow was something that unsettled even the most hardened labourers. The authorities approached cautiously, aware that the remains had been deliberately stripped of identifying features. Whoever placed the body there had wanted her to vanish without a trace. The use of lime had accelerated the decay, leaving the skin hardened and the limbs partially dissolved. The head and arms were entirely missing, removed with a precision that made investigators believe tools had been involved. Yet the clothing told a different story, a faint thread of humanity still clinging to the remains. 2 skirts, a blouse, and fragments of fabric that spoke of a modest woman who had once moved through life unnoticed. But to whom did they belong? For the first few days, police theories hovered between accident, suicide, and foul play. But the deliberate dismemberment removed any doubt. This was murder, planned, calculated, hidden with intention. The question was no longer what had happened, but who had been silenced so brutally. Meanwhile, back in Birmingham, Annie's sister continued writing letters that went unanswered. Her instincts told her something was wrong. Annie was secretive at times, yes, but she was never silent. She would never ignore family unless she was unable to reply. With growing fear, her sister reached out to the authorities, urging them to investigate her disappearance. This is when the threads began to tighten. Investigators learned Annie had left home claiming she was travelling to Liverpool to marry her mysterious fiancé, yet no one by his name could be traced. Then came confirmation that she had instead been living in Northampton under another identity entirely. This contradiction alarmed the detectives, and when the Birmingham officer learned of the unidentified body found only days earlier, the connection became impossible to ignore. Still, they needed proof. Attention turned to the Northampton lodgings where Annie and Andrew had lived as the fictitious Andersons. The landlady remembered the woman's skirts and blouse clearly. When shown the clothing recovered from the ditch, she recognized them without hesitation. The colour, the stitching, the wear, everything matched. Fear settled over the investigation like a cold fog. If the woman in the ditch was the lodger known as Mrs. Anderson, then the name she gave was false. The body belonged to someone else entirely, and that someone was Annie Pritchard. Yet even as her identity grew clearer, one haunting detail deepened the horror. There was still no sign of the baby she had carried out of the house. With the clothing identified, the investigation moved quickly toward establishing who last saw Annie alive. Every path led to one man, the only man who returned alone on the day she vanished. Andrew George McCrae. The search for evidence was far from over, but the case had shifted. This was no longer a missing person inquiry. It was the hunt for a killer. With Annie's clothing identified and her disappearance firmly linked to the body found at Dallington Heath, the investigation intensified. Detectives now turned their focus to Andrew McCrae, the man who had returned alone, who travelled freely after her disappearance, and whose explanations were beginning to unravel under scrutiny. Even so, the case needed solid physical evidence. A single misstep in Victorian courts could result in doubt, and doubt was all a man needed to escape conviction. The breakthrough came not from dramatic interrogation, but from a quiet, routine follow-up. Detectives learned that shortly after Annie vanished, Andrew had visited a local woman, Mrs. Bland, selling several items of clothing. They were women's garments, skirts, underclothes, odds and ends that belonged to someone who no longer needed them. Mrs. Bland purchased them without suspicion. It was only when officers arrived at her door with photographs and descriptions that she realized the significance of her transaction. Those items matched what Annie had owned. But the most damning discovery waited elsewhere. Investigators directed their attention to the warehouse connected to the Iemra Northampton sack, the same type of sack that had wrapped the headless body. Workers recalled Andrew visiting the building around the time Annie disappeared, behaving in a manner that drew subtle but lasting memories. Acting on this information, the police searched the premises thoroughly. In one of the dimmer storage areas, they found a patch of flooring stained in a way that lime could only partially disguise. Trapped in cracks and crevices were small strands of hair. Nearby lay fragments of bone, tiny but unmistakable, and the wooden boards bore deep, clean cuts, the type made by a saw rather than a natural break. This was not the scene of a mere accident. It was a site of dismemberment. The evidence was grim but essential. It confirmed that the sack had not travelled far before its contents were hidden in the ditch. It showed a deliberate effort to separate the victim's identifiable features from the rest of her remains, and it proved that Andrew had access to the building at the exact time such a gruesome act must have taken place. Still, the tragedy carried a deeper shadow. There was no trace of Annie's newborn son. Searches across the surrounding fields, wells, waterways, and outbuildings produced nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a bone, not a single lead. His disappearance became the silent weight pressing against every part of the investigation. When officers finally brought Andrew into custody, he maintained an air of calm detachment. He claimed Annie was alive. He claimed she had left him. At one point he even suggested she might have sailed for America. But the evidence spoke too loudly for his thin stories to stand. The borrowed identity, the hired cart, the lime, the clothing he sold, the warehouse traces. Each detail pushed him deeper into the center of a crime he could no longer distance himself from. By the time the case was prepared for court, the narrative was painfully clear. A vulnerable woman had vanished. A mutilated body had been found, and the only man who had walked out of those lodgings alive knew far more than he would ever admit. Next came the courtroom, and the fight for justice. By November 1892, Northampton was gripped by anticipation. The trial of Andrew Macabre had drawn the attention of the county, press, and curious public alike. Crowds gathered early outside the court, hoping to glimpse the man accused of such a shocking crime, while inside, the courtroom was tightly packed, every seat accounted for. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with a mixture of horror, fascination, and the unspoken knowledge that the details about to unfold were anything but ordinary. Andrew appeared noticeably thinner, his face drawn, yet he maintained a composed exterior as proceedings began. He pleaded, "Not guilty," standing firm even as the prosecution outlined the horrific chain of events: Annie Pritchard's disappearance, the birth of her child, her life in Northampton under a false identity, and ultimately the discovery of her mutilated body wrapped in the Emra sack. Witnesses were called, including her sister, who identified clothing found with the body, and the midwife who had attended Annie's childbirth, confirming her presence in Northampton weeks before her disappearance. Mrs. Bland's testimony regarding the clothing sold by Andrew added further weight, directly linking him to Annie's personal belongings. Medical evidence reinforced the prosecution's case. A local surgeon confirmed that bone fragments found in the warehouse bore clear signs of deliberate cutting, while traces of human hair matched Annie's known appearance. The deliberate removal of the head and arms, combined with lime, demonstrated planning and intent, acts designed to obscure identification and delay discovery. The defense argued a different narrative, suggesting a vagrant could have purchased the sacks, and that Annie might have voluntarily gone into hiding, perhaps to reunite with her former fiancé in America. But this version struggled under the weight of evidence. No letters had been received, the family had heard nothing, and multiple independent witnesses placed Annie in Northampton with Andrew during her final weeks. The judge's summing up was detailed and meticulous. He reminded the jury that the case rested on circumstantial evidence, yet it was evidence that pointed unwaveringly toward a single conclusion. Each fact, each witness, and each piece of material evidence fit together logically, leaving little room for reasonable doubt. After deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Andrew Macabre was sentenced to death. Despite his continued protestations of innocence, letters written to his wife and friends claiming he had not committed the crime did nothing to alter his fate. On the 10th of January 1893, he was executed at Northampton Prison, leaving behind a dark legacy marked by deception, betrayal, and the tragic death of a young mother and her child. The story of Annie Pritchard serves as a chilling reminder of how trust can be manipulated, how secrecy can mask horror, and how the quiet streets of Victorian England held shadows that would linger long after the headlines faded.